fantastic. So Thomas, you're here to talk to us about something spooky?
Yes, something extremely spooky, which is how to manage, how to navigate the big 3-letter word CSS. Because because we've said it already, architecture is a bit unspoken about in the industry. We have a lot of utility stuff, we have a lot of different ways of writing CSS, but when it comes to large-scale architecture and organizing, that's actually something we try to avoid. And luckily, people have thought about this quite a lot for quite a long time. And if you combine the best out of many of those approaches, you get something called the BIOS approach.
Ooh, BIOS? Is that right?
BIOS, exactly.
Okay. Awesome.
So it stands for BEM, ITCSS, Object-Oriented CSS, and SMACS. So should I explain those acronyms maybe a bit?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, should we put that up on the screen somewhere? Let me just see. I'll do a quick, what are those, what's the sketch thing called? What's that sketch app?
Figma?
No, it's Excalidraw.
Oh,
I had caps on, so
rolls right off the tongue.
It does. So let me just come on real quick. BIOS equals. All right, I'm going to share screen so you can see what I'm doing. BEM. What else was it?
ITCSS.
I'm trying to scroll in. There we go. ITCSS. Okay.
Object-Oriented CSS, or OOCSS.
Okay.
And SMACS, which is pronounced SMACSS.
SMACSS. Got it.
Right. And that's a lot of acronyms.
Yeah.
So many acronyms. And they are often postulated as equal, but I would argue that they actually are concerned with very different things when it comes to writing CSS.
Okay.
I'm really awkwardly cut off, but I can't actually fix it.
I'll work on it. I'll work on it. You keep going.
BEM stands for block element modifier, and it's basically I don't want to say controversial, but a lot of people have started to not like it, but it's a way of abstracting naming components. It's a methodology that most importantly tries to control or tries to give you a way of naming things. And you end up with supposedly semantic class names that are easy to read in CSS, but can get quite long rather quickly. Yes. So ITCSS, on the other hand, stands for Inverted Triangle CSS. I think a lot of people know ITCSS, but they don't actually know what the IT means, but it stands for Inverted Triangle.
Okay.
And what triangle do you mean? So there's a great talk by Harry Roberts, who has made or has coined this term and has made this methodology. It's a triangle that talks about reach. So it's about organizing selectors. So you have, or rule sets. So you have a rule sets who have a lot of reach. And then as the style sheet goes on, these rule sets become, on one hand, more specific, and on the other hand, more explicit. So as they become more specific and more explicit, there are less of them, right? So we have a lot of generic, a lot of far-reaching rule sets that are not very specific. And as the style sheet goes on, those become more explicit and more specific, but there are less of it.
Okay,
fewer.
Interesting.
And so this is a meta methodology, a way of thinking of about organizing your CSS, right? It's about organizing not your CSS, it's about organizing specifically your rule sets, right? And object-oriented CSS was, I think, one of the core methodologies, one of the first, and it's about thinking, or it was one of the first methodologies that coined these ways of thinking of reusing chunks of user interface, right? So we're talking about CSS objects that are supposedly super composable, but they are very tiny pieces of design information, very tiny pieces of CSS that have a singular or a single source of truth. And so it brings into the methodology, it brings this thinking of composable classes or of composable encapsulated pieces of design.
Okay.
And then there's SMACS. And SMAC stands for, OCSS was actually coined by Nicole Sullivan. And then there's SMACS, and SMACS stands for Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS, and it was coined by Jonathan Snook.
Okay.
And this brings an additional layer to the thing where you actually categorize rule sets based on their functionality in CSS. So they are grouped by theme, module, layout, state, and I think that's about it. So
Cool.
all of these, but not to their entirety, come together in the BIOS approach.
Okay.
So we take some of them, some of ITCSS, some of object-oriented CSS, and some of SMACS, and that comes together in this specific unique approach. I did not invent this term, but I've been using it since 2015, and I think 2 or 3 years ago, someone made like a huge, like a huge blog post about it, and then there was the name, and well, I was just a bit too late. But yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So you want to show it in action?
Yeah, I would love to. So I have prepared a super, super tiny website that I've definitely not made just today.
But I love it, chat. He made this today? Look at this. I love it. Can I share this with the chat? Because
yeah, absolutely.
I love your design sense. Like you make
seriously,
look at this adorable site, chat. I wish I made this in a morning, Thomas.
Yeah.
My goodness, it's gorgeous.
Yeah. And this is just to demonstrate, it's extremely real life, obviously, right? But this is just to demonstrate some of the reusability and the architecture that goes into a BIOS site. So we're mostly gonna use I also have it on GitHub, so we can look at the ITCSS. But first of all, let's look actually into the code. This entire architecture assumes that you are looking into the CSS via the class name, right? You're looking into via, well, not the class name, but via looking at the actual generated HTML code. So the first thing that we can see in the body, it has the class layout on it. And this is actually a block, right? It's a BEM block because it has additional elements, and those elements are header, main, and footer. But they also have an additional class on it. This is kind of where usually people struggle when it comes to BEM, because they are trying to confine all of the specific information either into one class and make like a huge class name, or they start to nest indefinitely because the naming methodology forces them to start a new block. But you can just put on multiple classes on it. This is kind of, to a certain degree, where the OOCSS comes in. So here a new block begins, the header block, and this block has 2 elements. And again, one of those elements is a different element. And this logo, even though it has the BEM syntax, is actually an object. This brings to a very specific part in ITCSS, which is that if you were to take this extremely literal, you couldn't call a logo an object, right, in terms of OCSS, because it would have to be separated much more. But the main point here is to improve developer experience. What this is intended to is that when I want to make changes here, I want to do something, I want to refactor it, I want to maybe create something new that is similar or create a variation from it, I can go by name. I can look into logo, I can look into layout, and I'm gonna, because of how it is being used, I know exactly where to search for it. And that is what ITCSS is doing.
This is really interesting. I don't think I've ever seen this kind of like block element and then a block on the same class level. It's almost like a handoff.
That's exactly it. And there's also a specific detail that actually even the backend developers that I've worked with started to pick up, which is between logo and header logo, as well as layout header and header, there's not one space, there are 2 spaces. So this is a very similar thing that CubeCSS by Andy Bell is doing. Yeah. He uses square brackets to separate things visually, and which is basically something similar. So we can create groups of classes that are somehow related together in terms of, if I'm going to look for this class, I'm going to find it near this. And we can, there's an example for this in the header navigation. If you look into the header, if you open that one up, it's one of the elements. That's the header _ navigation. So it's an element of header. And here we have the button, and that we can't see it here, but it should be there. The button in itself is its own. In that case, it's an object because it's not made to be very complex. And I'm thinking of it as something very encapsulated, something that I compose and reuse. But it's also an element of the header. And it also has a state class on it, which is called isOpening. So that's a SMAX class. And it is grouped together with the header navigation menu button element, which means that if you were to look for this specific class, you wouldn't look for it in button, you would look for it in the header BEM block, basically.
Okay.
And the same goes for the nav element below, which has header menu on it. There's also a menu element on it because the menu could be reused again. And so there's the element of reusability here, but it's mainly for readability when you actually look at this in code, because these things in a real world example, they would probably not be, especially in an SBA context, they wouldn't be in one big chunk. They wouldn't be in one big file. Instead, you're going to have like a layout component, a header component, a logo component, a button component, and maybe a menu component. And that way, it's very easy to still have a BEM syntax, but still have them like fit in together like this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Shall we look at the code?
So I'm sorry?
Shall we look at the code on GitHub, maybe?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll send you a link to the GitHub repository.
Yeah, please. Oh my goodness. Like, just, I don't know. It seems, it's one of those things that seem obvious now. Right? Like, oh yeah, why don't we just kind of make that connection? But wow. That's really just that handoff process, and then you are able to get both, but also keep the styles and that they can be global. Yeah, you've just kind of opened my eyes. Okay, so I need the GitHub. Wow.
Right, and this is also an 11T site because I'm quite the opposite when it comes to nunchucks. I am very willing to spun up an entire 11T site, which is so taxing, not just so that I can write just a little bit of nunchucks because I love nunchucks.
Awesome, that's awesome. No shade intended, just
no shade at all.
Flavors.
No, it's just exactly. Yeah. Right, so here we have SCSS.
Cool.
And if we click on SCSS, we immediately see style.css. This is the entry point, and let's look into this. So this basically displays our inverted triangle. So from the very top, because the order on where elements enter the style sheet matters. So first we have the settings, we have the tools, but we don't have to actually import them because they are basically just living in the pre-processing layer. Then we have generic, we have elements, we have objects, we have components, and then there would also be trumps, which in a later iteration, Harry Roberts has renamed to utilities. And I didn't actually use the word trumps because I started to really use it in 2016, and I just did not want to see that word, so I called it overlords, which is not really better, but yeah. So
small baby steps. Let's take baby
steps. Exactly. Tiny resistance, tiny international resistance. And these kind of speaks. This is just the ITCSS organization. So we are grouping. He calls it layers, right? So we are having these different types of layers, and different rule sets go into different layers. Generic is extremely generic. This is where I put my reset. This is where I write my root selector. And I also write in here the reset exactly. You could also just use npm here and import it from a node module. And here I do my entire root thing. I also write if you look to the very bottom, I also put the selection in here, like the selection pseudo element. Yeah. This is just standard setup, basically.
Cool.
And what I also utilize, I have to say, the Sass module system has made this much more reusable than it ever has before, because it was completely compatible before, but it was still at the very end, all of it was still, or you still had to kind of be aware where certain variables, functions, and mixins were included before, because there was no name spacing, right? But now if I go into, let's say, generic SCSS again, and I have a use at the block at the very top, like the use as media, this is going to be completely namespaced, and it's not going to interfere at all. Right, so it has made it much more reusable. And I also have
just a couple minutes. Do we want to hit? Okay, I just want to make sure. Cool.
Oh, sorry, I'm totally interrupting you. We have a bit of a delay. I'm so sorry. Okay. The one little thing that is interesting, if you look into components, if you go just a bit back and look into components, this is where the main juice is going to be. And if you look into header, this is where everything that you've seen in that header is going to take place. And I've also made this an extreme example. If you look into the very bottom, I have a very long concatenation here. You see that makes the close button, close menu, open menu, etc. This is something that you would not have to do in CSS at all. You could just use inline style, or make it via JavaScript entirely, or use a utility class for this, right? So this is where you could also mix stuff. And if chat is interested, I can also post in the Frontend Horse Discord, which join. I can also post an example of what this is doing to a very large code base before BIOS was applied and after BIOS was applied. Or I can send you the screenshot and you show it if you want.
I can show it super quick. Yeah, absolutely.
I just don't want to take up even more time.
Oh, good. Oh, is it the ones that you sent earlier?
No, I have prepared a special one.
Cool.
I'm sending it now.
Right. Look at this.
Yes. Oh, right. So we have a before. Oh, it's so large. So this is before. This is a very large code base. This has about 8,000 rule sets and about 50,000 lines. The previous project that I worked before, I managed about 900,000 lines of CSS in total, and it was all powered by this. So this is how you look before. Everything that's blue spooky. Is class element selectors, class selectors, element selectors, and everything that is red, which is here very nicely seen, is ID selectors, and you can see them scattered around, right? So we are trying to use we're trying to use an increasing curve, because if we do that, everything that comes later will automatically override everything that was before if it has the same specificity, because then source order matters. And if that is the case, you don't have to write specific selectors to override very simple ones.
Got it.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Got it. So there's the stats just to prove that this. I mean, just showing me the class name and seeing that kind of like handoff. First off, just like I'm already like, yeah, okay, this immediately makes sense. But then that just even more proof. Thomas, thank you for coming by. That was
Thanks for having me.
That was super spooky. I would love to dig into this further with you. The chat was loving this.
Yay!
This is just like a whole thing that I know nothing about, but now like I'm intrigued. So thank you so much. Have some American Halloween candy and enjoy.
Yum! Thank you so much. Bye bye.
See you later, buddy. Thanks for coming through.